We're here with keyboardist and cellist Dan Ryan to talk about tuning and temperaments. So how do you go about tuning a historical keyboard instrument? What are you listening for?
Well, the concept of in tune is actually something that has changed over the centuries. So before we get into the mechanics of tuning, we actually have to define what in tune is. So I can play a little something on the piano to demonstrate this. So when we talk about what in tune means, it meant something very different in the past than it does today. Today, what in tune means is that all the notes of the circle of fifths are very slightly out of tune, so that there's really no such thing as completely in tune, but they're all equally spaced, so that all of the keys that we play in music sound basically the same level of in-tuneness or out-of-tuneness. So I can demonstrate that by a familiar piece. And if I were to play that in a different key, they both sound about the same level of in tune. So back in the Middle Ages, their idea of in tune was to tune a series of fifths and fourths that cover the whole circle of fifths. And the circle of fifths is a cycle of fifths or fourths that covers the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. But there's a problem that arises when you do that, which I will show you. So I've got C and G, pure, G and D, pure, D and A, pure, A and E, pure, E and B, pure, B and F sharp, pure, F sharp and C sharp, pure, C sharp and G sharp, pure, G sharp and D sharp, pure, D sharp and A sharp, pure. Notice I'm not using any flats. And then A sharp and E sharp, pure. And going back to my original C. Pure. Now I have my original C on a different keyboard. That's my original one. Here's what I wound up with.
Oh, it's a significant difference.
Yeah, it's a big difference. So this was called the Pythagorean comma. And this is the problem that medieval theorist Pythagorean was dealing with. So in the Middle Ages, what they did was, since they only played on what we call the white keys, with very few accidentals, they just stuck that difference between, say, the A sharp and the D sharp, so that they wouldn't be using those notes, so nobody would really notice. So if I were to, I'm restarting my circle of fifths on the flat side. So I first start on the sharp side, go all the way to G sharp, and then go on the flat side, going back to middle C. By the way, we always start, when we tune, we always start at middle C, not A440. That's a 19th century invention.
Interesting.
Because the circle, all the keys start at C. So it makes much more sense. So here's the wolf. You have a D sharp and an A flat. Notice A flat is not the same as G sharp.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Definitely not pure.
Yep. So that's the Pythagorean comma expressed in that wolf. So now I'll play a little piece. After I tune the rest of the instrument, I'll play a little piece tuned in Pythagorean so you can hear how that sounds. This is a piece from the Codex Fienza, which is one of the earliest pieces of keyboard music, a collection from the early 15th century. Now, one of the other features of Pythagorean tuning is that the major thirds are quite high. They're quite strident. So if we were to play that Bach again, not a very pleasant sound. And that's why, the thirds in medieval music were considered a dissonance for that reason. But somewhere along the line, in the Renaissance, they suddenly discovered the beauty of pure thirds. So we can take that very strident third. Suddenly, the sound opens up. And we have that lovely bloom in the sound. And how do they tune with that pure third? How do they modify the Pythagorean? Because you still have this problem with the wolf. Well, this Pythagorean comma, the difference between the two C's, you can divide that up into pieces. And it just so happens if you took that interval of a Pythagorean comma and divided it into 4, so you tuned a stretch of 4/5 and tune them out of tune by that precise interval, Pythagorean comma. Then you've compromised on the fifths. They're not quite as nice. But the third is so pure and so powerful that it kind of swamps any impurities in the fifths. So then those beautiful triads we have in later types of music start to come to the fore. And it completely changed our idea of harmony, really, by this adaptation. So why don't I tune the rest of this in what's called quarter comma mean tone, because you've divided the Pythagorean comma into 4 parts. And we'll see what that sounds like. This is a piece by William Byrd called My Lady Neville's Ground.
Wow, that piece really highlights the pure thirds.
Yes, you can hear how they ring and resonate. So as we get into the later 17th century and into the aesthetic of the Baroque, we notice that there are limitations to the mean tone tuning, because as composers started to go from more of a modal means of harmonic language to a tonal one where they explore many different keys, we find that it's not very versatile in going to those keys. So for example, this note here is a C sharp. This is a perfect third with A, yeah? But a C sharp and a D flat are not the same note in mean tone. So, you hear that? Because I'm playing a C sharp instead of a D flat. So if we were to play our Bach again, in C major, and our C sharp major, and you notice we still have our friend, the wolf. The wolf is still there. So how do we tame the wolf? And how do we play in different keys? Basically, the wolf is a fifth that is wide. So they started to fill that in by maybe we could tune some of our fifths rather than wide, tune them narrow, and thereby narrowing that gap. And that'll buy you a few little chords in the flat side, so that you can play an E flat and an E flat major chord and a B major chord that uses either an E flat or a D sharp. And they don't sound great, but for a passing harmony, it's okay. In the later 18th century, they really were looking for more versatility. So they actually began to combine aspects of Pythagorean and mean tone together. So if you were to tune part in mean tone and part in Pythagorean, you could really spread out that wolf tone and get something that's usable. Let me demonstrate a temperament called Kernberger 3. These are mean tone fifths. Tune C to F, F to B flat, B flat to E flat. There's our wolf, which we filled in. I filled out a few more notes you can hear. So, going back to our G major, but A flat major, not great, but it's acceptable. E major. So what we come up with is that each key, while not being equally in tune, has different characters. So that actually became quite important in the Baroque aesthetic of the different characters of the keys. And they were all usable, but composers began to sort of get those characters in their minds when they were writing pieces and sort of bake them into the style of music they were writing. And Bach, in his Well-Tempered Clavier, famously used all 24 major and minor keys, right? But he didn't consider them to be all equal. So this wasn't an advocacy for equal temperament, but it was a demonstration of the different characters of the keys. And Bach's style of tuning and those in the later 18th century became a little bit more refined than this temperament that I just tuned, Kernberger 3. They further subdivided this Pythagorean comma into smaller bits, mostly 1/6 comma. So they divided into 6 parts. Sometimes tuned other fifths pure, like Pythagorean, but sometimes tuned them in as equal tempered fifths, which would be 1/12. So there was a theorist named Neidhart who proposed different temperaments for different situations, which I think was really clever because the mean tone is such an attractive sound that you don't want to get rid of it unless you really have to.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a temperament for what he called a dorf, or a village, that was basically mean tone. And then he had a temperament for a small city, which was maybe something closer to this Kernberger 3, a little bit more versatile but still had the purity of the familiar keys. And then he had a temperament for a large city, which was already getting more equal, still favoring the familiar keys, but getting a little bit more equal. And then he had one for Hof, or court. And what temperament do you think he used for that?
Equal?
You're right, equal temperament, yeah. The most sophisticated music making there is. He advocated for equal temperament. And that was in 1724.
Oh,
already.
That's much earlier than I would have guessed.
Yeah, much earlier. Yep. And it's quite interesting. We don't know whether all courts were using equal temperament at this time. I tend to doubt it. But that's the aesthetic where he was at. So, I will now tune a temperament that's kind of closer to what's in Bach's style. And I'll play a couple pieces by Bach that show the different characters of the keys. So here we go. This is something it's approximating volati, or a 6th comma, having fifths of a 6th comma and then other fifths being pure, known as a circulating temperament.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. So I'll play a movement from a suite by Bach for keyboard. It's an E flat major, and one of the things that is nicely highlighted is the fact that the A flats and the D flats are, because of the temperament, just a little bit low. So they make a nice 7th interval, which is very kind of very expressive. Makes a little softer sound, and I think he really brings this out in this suite.
So D major is, of course, the key of triumphant affect. Think of Bach's overtures that use trumpets, and Handel's Hallelujah Chorus, all in D major. And so this, the key has a certain brightness to it, but it is not completely pure, so it has that sense of brilliance about it.
Yeah, definitely bright. You can feel the brilliance to it.
Mm-hmm.
So how did we get from these temperaments to the equal temperament that's more or less ubiquitous in Western music? When did equal temperament emerge as the way to tune?
Isn't that interesting? Well, we know we have early instances of it, of course, in the 18th century, and they knew about it all through the Renaissance. But of course, why would they want to use it, right? As music became much more sophisticated in terms of the key areas, equal temperament just became more and more universal. It was first, I think, more universal in Germany, where composers of the classical and romantic era were really going freely from key to key. And so we have evidence of even the Germanic speakers in this country. There was an organ built in 1800 by the Moravians, and the very meticulous organ builder, Tannenbaum, left instructions on how to tune it. And it was, he said to tune it in equal temperament and showed how to do it.
Wow. Oh, interesting.
But on the other hand, in England, they loved mean tone, and it was very, very late in coming. Equal temperament was very, very late in coming to England, and there was a composer named Samuel Sebastian Wesley, who was mid-19th century, and he insisted that all the organs be tuned in mean tone.
Oh, really? Wow, that late.
That late. So it just took different countries, different spans of time to sort of catch up and be more universal with the rest of Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what is the knowledge of historical temperaments? How does that affect the way you play a piece of music? What is revealed about the music by playing it in the way it would have been tuned centuries ago in some instances?
Well, it's really eye-opening, or ear-opening, I should say, because when you hear those open harmonies of mean tone, you can't help but be affected by that and linger on those ones that invite the resonance from the instrument and the expressive qualities of what is being written. There are pieces during this transition time between mean tone and the circulating temperaments that we talked about, those compromised temperaments, where composers were very clearly making use of the out-of-tune qualities of those enharmonic notes, D sharp versus E flat, for example. And you could tell that they were really going for an effect when they wanted those out-of-tune notes. So that definitely affects the interpretation. And then in the case of later music by later 18th century composers, the idea of the key colors really comes to the fore. And so if one just listens carefully and responds to the different resonances created by these different key colors, then the interpretation sort of goes along with that.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing all this knowledge and retuning the harpsichord countless times to show us how it developed through the ages. And it's been very, very, very interesting, and I've learned a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.